It was your average, hot, sunny day in the desert at Wolf's Circus. Popee Paraphone seemed particularly angrier than usual that day, as he spent nearly the entire day practicing his knife-throwing skills at the fence in a rather violent manner. The air was thick with tension, vibrating with the rhythmic, aggressive thwack of steel meeting wood. Kedamono sat a short distance away, perched upon a small stool. He was currently holding a drumstick in one paw, whilst idly tapping a rhythm against his knee with the other, but his attention was entirely fixed upon the red-clad performer in front of him. His no mask was set to a worried expression, eyebrows slanted inward and a slight downturn to the mouth as he watched the knives fly. Each throw was more violent than the last. Popee was not merely practicing, he was venting. The knives were not just hitting the fence, they were burying themselves deep into the grain, splintering the wood with a ferocity that suggested that he wanted to destroy the very target that he was aiming for. Kedamono flinched slightly every time the knife landed with a particularly loud crack, as he felt a pang of anxiety begin to rise within his chest. Usually the wolf could tolerate Popee's eccentricities, but this level of aggression was palpable. It made the purple wolf want to shrink into his own fur. He wanted to go over and offer some comfort, perhaps in the form of a snack, in an attempt to soothe his master's temper. However, he knew better than to interrupt a focused or furious Popee. He fidgeted with the hem of his orange boxers, his eyes darting from the fence back to his master's tensed shoulders. He reached into the cardboard bucket that was beside him in the hopes of finding a piece of fried chicken to perhaps distract the clown, but then he hesitated. If he approached now, he very well may end up with a knife thrown his way instead of the fence. Slowly, tentatively, Kedamono leaned forward, his mask shifting slightly to a nervous expression, his large eyes watching the blur of silver as the next blade whistled through the air. He let out a tiny, silent puff of breath, his heart thumping in time with the impact of the steel. The more knives Popee threw, the angrier he seemed to become. The heavier his breathing grew, until he lost complete control of his boiling-over temper. With one swift throw and a scream of utter rage, he embedded the last 10 remaining knives into the fence, all at once. His breathing became more ragged, more uncontrolled, as he began to tremble with fury. He then pulled at the bunny ears on his hat with another grunt of frustration, as he angrily stomped his foot a few times. He then turned to glare at Kedamono, on the verge of tears in spite of his rage, before storming off back into his tent, angrily mumbling beneath his breath all the while. The sheer force of the final volley sent a shudder through the ground. Kedamono practically jumped out of his skin, his mask snapping instantly to a terrified expression, wide trembling eyes and a gaping mouth. He froze, his drumstick suspended in midair, as he watched the frantic, chaotic display of steel. The sound of 10 knives hitting the wood simultaneously was louder than a gunshot echoing throughout the circus grounds, as Popee's rage boiled over into that trembling, tearful frustration. Kedamono felt a wave of genuine guilt, wondering what he possibly could have done to upset his master this time. He watched as the red-clad performer stomped and tugged at his hat, feeling the heavy weight of the tension in the air. When Popee had finally turned that piercing, furious glare toward him, Kedamono instinctively pulled his knees up to his chest, making himself as small as possible. He looked as if he wanted to melt into the sand that was beneath him. He watched silently, with wide eyes, as Popee stormed off toward the tent, the muffled sounds of angry grumbling following in his wake. Once the tent flap had settled, the silence that followed was deafening. Kedamono sat alone in the sudden quiet, his mask slowly shifting from terrified to deeply saddened. The sad mask featured drooping eyes with a small wobbling frown. He felt a small tug to his heartstrings, since he hated seeing Popee so upset, even though Popee could be a handful at times, and even though he was often quite mean to the Purple Wolf. Kedamono could not stand the thought of his master being in such a state of distress. Kedamono stood up slowly, his movements hesitant. He looked toward the tent, then down at the bucket of food that was sitting beside him. He then reached into it and carefully pulled out a piece of fried chicken, the savory scent wafting up.
Maybe if he eats something, he'll feel better,
Kedamono thought. With a determined yet nervous twitch of his ears, he began to trot toward the tent. He moved quietly, trying not to make too much noise, as he approached the entrance with the chicken held out as if it were a peace offering. He paused at the flap, his mask shifting to hesitant, wondering if he should make his presence known or just peek inside. Once Popee had made it inside the tent, he had collapsed onto the cot that he often used as a bed from exhaustion, still breathing heavily with rage as he lied down on his side with his back to the tent's entrance. His breathing gradually became shakier. Unable to hold back his tears any longer, all anger gave way to sorrow, as Popee buried his face into his gloved hands and began to cry as quietly as possible. The tent flap rustled softly as Kedamono cautiously nudged his way inside. He halted a few steps from the cot, his mask shifting to an expression of profound heartbreak. The eyebrows were raised high and slanted, whilst the mouth was a small, trembling oval. The sight of his master curled up and shaking with silent sobs hit the purple wolf hard. He did not want to intrude or draw any unwanted attention to Popee's vulnerability, since he knew how much the clown valued his pride. However, he could not just stand there and allow his master to suffer in silence. Moving with the stealth of a shadow, Kedamono crept up to the side of the cot. He made no sound, his paws barely touching the fabric of the tent floor. Kedamono stood there for a long moment, his mask flickering between uncertain and deeply concerned expressions. Finally, he reached out his trembling paw to gently place the piece of fried chicken on the edge of the cot, within easy reach of Popee's trembling shoulders. Then, with a hesitant motion, Kedamono did something he rarely dared to do. He leaned forward to place his soft, furry paw upon Popee's back, giving it a slow, rhythmic pat. Kedamono hoped that despite the turmoil, Popee could feel the genuine care radiating from his supportive touch. Popee flinched a little in surprise as he briefly turned to look at Kedamono, before quickly turning back around to hide his tear-stained face. However, he had looked just long enough for Kedamono to see the pure sorrow that had twisted his countenance.
Go away!
Popee naturally tried to get defensive, but his own voice came out as a heartbroken sob. The flinch made Kedamono's heart lurch. The wolf felt a sting of rejection, his mask momentarily flickering to a hurt expression. His eyebrows tilted sharply with a small quivering line for a mouth. He knew how Popee was. The clown hated being seen when he was not in control, especially when he felt as fragile as glass. However, his voice, that broken, jagged sob that hitched in Popee's throat, it completely melted Kedamono's hesitation. To the purple wolf, the command did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a plea for mercy. Kedamono did not move away. Instead, he did the exact opposite. Kedamono sank down onto the floor beside the cot, ignoring the discomfort of the hard ground. He did not push his luck by trying to hug Popee or force a conversation. He simply stayed close enough so that Popee could feel the warmth radiating from his fur. Kedamono's mask shifted back to determined kindness. He reached over again, more confidently this time, to gently place the piece of fried chicken a few inches away from Popee's hand.
Eat when you can. It's okay.
Kedamono gently urged. He then went back to being a quiet, loyal presence in the dim lighting of the tent. He refused to leave his master's side until the shaking stopped, and even then, he would probably linger just a little bit longer, just in case. He let out a very soft, rhythmic huff of air. Not a sigh of annoyance, but a calming sound intended to mimic a heartbeat, attempting to provide a steady rhythm for Popee to follow as the clown struggled to catch his own breath. Popee no longer had the strength to fight back or even acknowledge the chicken Kedamono had placed on his cot as he finally broke down into a full fit of loud, broken, anguished sobs. The sound of those loud, uninhibited sobs tore through Kedamono's heart more effectively than any of the knives Popee had thrown earlier. It was not the angry, sharp barking of a tantrum. It was the raw, gut-wrenching sound of someone who had simply reached their limit. Kedamono's mask underwent a rapid emotional transformation. It flickered from concern to panic, and finally settled upon a mask of pure, overwhelming empathy. Eyes brimming with simulated tears, with a mouth pulled into a soft mourning curve, Kedamono felt a lump begin to form within his throat, his chest tightening with the sympathetic pain of watching his master fall apart. Seeing Popee so utterly defeated, so stripped of his usual bravado, Kedamono decided that being careful was no longer an option. He needed to be a comfort to his master. Ignoring the risk of getting yelled at or pushed away, the violet wolf crawled onto the edge of the cot. He moved with a gentle, fluid grace, settling himself behind Popee. Kedamono did not try to pull the sobbing clown into a tight embrace, because he did not want his master to feel constricted, instead opting to drape his paws partially over Popee in order to act as a heavy, warm, living-weighted blanket. Kedamono then leaned his head forward, pressing his masked forehead softly against the back of Popee's shoulder as he wrapped his forelegs loosely around the clown's waist. He would act as a silent anchor in the middle of Popee's emotional storm. Every time a particularly loud, anguished sob ripped through the air, Kedamono would squeeze his master just a little bit tighter.
I'm right here. I've got you. It's okay to break down.
Kedamono reassured, no longer caring about the piece of chicken he had abandoned, nor did he care about the greasy mess it left behind. In this moment, Kedamono's entire world was narrowed down to the shaking figure in his forelegs, to providing whatever quiet, steady warmth he could muster to help stave off the darkness of his master's mysterious grief. For once, Popee did not reject the affection. He just continued to cry for what felt like hours, until it felt like he could no longer produce tears, his sobs eventually dying down into quiet, pained whimpers. By the time he had finally stopped crying, his eyes and the skin of his cheeks were red with irritation from all of the rubbing. The transition from violent sobs to those small, exhausted whimpers was the most telling sign of all. Kedamono did not move an inch, keeping his weight steady and warm against Popee's back, afraid that if he let go, the clown might shatter completely all over again. As he waited, his own mask settled into a tender expression, soft eyes with a gentle closed-mouthed smile, as he watched the rise and fall of Popee's shoulders as they finally began to stabilize. As the silence returned to the tent, it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence from before. It was a tired, hollowed-out peace. Kedamono then carefully pulled back just enough to sit upright, though he remained on the cot. He looked down at Popee, noticing the telltale redness of his eyes, as well as the inflamed skin of his cheeks. A wave of protective anxiety washed over the wolf, since he hated seeing his master in such a state of physical discomfort. Moving with extreme gentleness, as if he were handling a piece of fine porcelain, Kedamono reached for the small cloth he usually kept tucked in his waistband for cleaning his masks. He dipped the rag into the small water basin near the bedside, wringing it out until it was just damp and cool. He then leaned back in, his mask shifting to one of quiet care. Kedamono then began to lightly dab the cool, damp cloth against Popee's reddened cheeks and around his eyes. He was incredibly careful, his movements slow and rhythmic in an attempt to soothe the stinging irritation left behind by the tears. Kedamono did not try to force Popee to look at him or talk to him. He simply performed this small, quiet act of service, his lavender fur brushing against the edge of the cot, offering a sense of normalcy and comfort in the aftermath of the storm. He wanted to show, without the use of words, that the outburst was over, and that the world was still standing, even if everything still felt a little shaky. Popee remained still and silent, even as Kedamono cleaned him up. The poor clown looked completely miserable, nearly depressed, as he occasionally let out a small whimper or a hitched breath. The sight of Popee, usually so loud, so vibrant, and so demanding of the world's attention, sitting there so hollow, so motionless, was almost more painful for Kedamono to witness than any screaming would have been. The way Popee just let him clean him up, without a single protest or a sharp elbow to the ribs, told Kedamono everything he needed to know. The fire was out, leaving only the cooling ash in its wake. Every time a small, pathetic whimper escaped Popee's lips, or his chest hitched in a way that suggested he was still fighting the ghost of a sob, Kedamono's mask would ripple. It shifted from focus to a deeply pained expression, his eyes drooping with a heavy, soulful sadness. Kedamono felt as though he should reach into his own chest and pull out his own still-beating heart just to give it to the clown, anything to stop his master's misery. Realizing that the cool cloth might not be enough to lift the heavy cloud of depression hanging over the tent, Kedamono set the damp cloth aside. He no longer wanted to leave any space between them, so he moved even closer. He reached out, and with a tenderness that was almost reverent, took one of Popee's hands within his massive paws. He was careful not to squeeze it too tightly. He just held it, his warm furred fingers enveloping Popee's smaller gloved hand. Kedamono began to rub slow, soothing circles into the back of Popee's hand with his thumb, a grounding motion meant to tether him back to the present. He then did the only thing he could think to do to bridge the gap of silence. He leaned his head down, resting his chin softly against the top of Popee's head. Kedamono then let out a long, slow, calming breath, hoping the steady vibration of his lungs would act as a lullaby for the broken man.
Do you want to talk about it?
Kedamono then finally spoke up after a nearly unbearable moment of silence, willing to stay with his master for as long as it took for the light to return to his beautiful blue eyes.
What does it matter? Who even cares?
Popee grumbled in response, with barely any energy.
Everyone hates me anyway.
The last part came out as more of a broken whimper, as fresh tears stung Popee's already bloodshot eyes. The words hit Kedamono like a physical blow to the stomach. The sheer hopelessness in Popee's voice made the purple wolf's heart ache so fiercely that he felt like he might actually cry himself. To hear the most energetic, ego-driven person he knew claim that he was unloved was almost unbearable. As the fresh tears began to sting Popee's eyes, Kedamono's mask underwent a frantic emotive shift. It rippled from pain to a desperate, intense devotion, the eyes widening with a fierce need to prove him wrong, whilst the mouth was set in a firm, determined line. Kedamono not only held Popee's hand this time, he shifted his entire body, sliding closer until he could wrap both forelegs around the clown in a proper, tight embrace. He pulled Popee's head against his chest, tucking the red-clad performer under his chin in an attempt to shield him from the world as if he could physically block out the lies that Popee was telling himself. Kedamono began to rock back and forth, a slow rhythmic motion designed to soothe. He pressed his face into the top of Popee's hat, letting out a series of soft, rhythmic huffs, the wolf version of a comforting hum.
I care.
Kedamono desperately attempted to reassure his master, as his grip tightened just a fraction.
I care more than anyone.
Kedamono pulled back just enough to look Popee in the eye, forcing the clown to see the absolute sincerity in his gaze. He then grabbed Popee's other hand and pressed it firmly against his own chest, right over his racing heart. Kedamono then let the pulse thud against Popee's palm, a steady, living, undeniable proof of his devotion to his master.
Feel this. I am here. My heart beats because you are in the world. You are not alone.
Kedamono insisted. Then with a sudden, gentle movement, he reached for the piece of fried chicken again. Kedamono knew it might seem silly, but he picked up the small tender morsel and held it toward Popee's lips, his mask softening into an expression of gentle pleading. It was a small, simple gesture of life and sustenance, an attempt to pull Popee back from the brink of his own dark thoughts, to remind him that there was still sweetness to be found, even in the midst of a breakdown. Popee's lips trembled as he broke down into another fit of sobs all over again. He appreciated the gesture, but his nerves were just too twisted up to allow him to eat even a little at the moment.
Yesterday, when I got on stage, the crowd started booing me and throwing things at me. Someone even threw a bottle. I didn't even get a chance to do a trick or tell a joke. They just hated me.
Popee practically sobbed as Kedamono remembered Popee returning home that night covered in rotten fruit, bruises, and even a few cuts. Kedamono remembered how furious Popee looked that night, as tears had even begun to well up within the clown's eyes then.
And if that wasn't bad enough, everyone forgot it was my birthday yesterday.
Popee added as his sobbing increased in volume. The revelation hit Kedamono with the force of a tsunami, as Popee spilled the heartbreaking truth about the booze, the projectiles, the humiliation, and finally the staggering loneliness of a forgotten birthday. Kedamono felt a surge of pure, unadulterated guilt. Yesterday, October 10th, Kedamono remembered he had been so busy helping with the setup for the evening show, so caught up in the chaos of the circus, that he had failed to even bring a single piece of fried chicken or a small celebratory gesture. He had let the most important person in his life feel invisible and hated on his special day. It was not like Popee even demanded a big celebration. He would have been fine if just anyone had at least wished him a happy birthday, just to let him know they cared enough about him to remember him. Kedamono's mask rippled violently, shifting from pain to a look of utter, soul-crushing remorse. His eyes grew wide and watery. His mouth trembled in a silent, mournful gasp. The chicken was forgotten about, pushed aside as Kedamono realized that it would take more than just food to fix this. Only presence and atonement could heal his master's wounded heart now.
Oh, Master, I am so sorry.
Kedamono practically enveloped Popee into an almost crushing embrace, pulling the clown into his lap in order to cradle him like a wounded child. Kedamono let his soft purple ears drape over Popee's head, creating a small private cocoon of fur and warmth that shut out the rest of the circus. He then began to nuzzle the side of Popee's face, his nose pressing gently against the red-striped fabric of the clown's outfit in an attempt to absorb some of the sorrow through his own skin. Kedamono then let out a series of low, melodic, almost whimpering sounds from his throat, a vibration of pure, unfiltered affection. Then he did something that he had never done before. Kedamono reached into a small hidden pocket in his waistband. He always carried a few small trinkets for emergencies. He pulled out a small bright orange ribbon, something he had found while cleaning the circus grounds. It was simple, but it was also bright as well as beautiful. Kedamono carefully tied the ribbon around the base of one of the rabbit ears on Popee's hat. It was a small, silent ceremony. Kedamono then took Popee's hands and pressed them to his face, forcing the clown to feel the warmth of his fur, along with the sincerity of his expression. His mask settled into a look of fierce protective love. He stared into Popee's eyes, his gaze intense, unyielding, as if he were trying to burn the memory of the crowd's boos out of Popee's mind, and replace it with the absolute certainty of his own devotion.
They were wrong. They were blind. But I see you. I always see you.
Kedamono then attempted to soothe his master further. Popee's sobbing subsided into small surprise whimpers when Kedamono had tied the orange ribbon to his hat. He smiled softly, since all he really wanted was for someone to show him they cared, before practically clinging to Kedamono in a silent act of forgiveness.
Thank you.
Popee sniffled. He was still hurt by the crowd instantly booing him, not giving him a chance, as it was a huge shot to his confidence. He was still hurt that his own father had forgotten his birthday, and did not even seem to care. He was even a little hurt that his best friend had forgotten his birthday, but the reassurance, the small gesture of an apology, was enough for Popee's hurt feelings to begin to heal. The moment Popee's arms wrapped around Kedamono in that silent, trembling act of forgiveness, Kedamono felt a weight lift from his own chest, replaced by a profound sense of relief. The quiet thanks was so fragile, yet the most beautiful thing the wolf had ever heard, even if it was spoken in a voice cracked by tears. Kedamono's mask shimmered, the remorse fading into a look of pure, radiant joy mixed with the lingering tenderness. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and his mouth curved into a soft, genuine smile that reached his very soul. He squeezed Popee back, holding him with a strength that said he would never ever let go again. Kedamono knew that the wounds were not entirely gone. He knew that the sting of the crowd's cruelty and the hollow ache of his father's indifference were deep scars that would not vanish overnight. Kedamono knew that the bruise to Popee's confidence would take time to knit back together. However, he was just glad he was able to bring his master some comfort, no matter how small. Kedamono was willing to do whatever it took to help his master fully heal.